limits of debate in this country are established before the debate even begins, and everyone else is marginalized. They're made to seem either to be communist or some sort of disloyal person. A kook, there's a word, and now it's conspiracy. See, they've made that something that should not be even entertained for a minute, that powerful people might get together and have a plan. Doesn't happen. You're a kook. You're a conspiracy buff.
Hello everybody, back again. I'm going to show maybe up to 5 videos, I think it is. It's again, the channel name is Schism206. We're going through Occult Science 0.0, 0.1, 1.0, 1.1, and 1.2. 0.0 is Introduction and the Flat Earth Debate. And then 0.1 will be navigating references, notes, annotations, corrections, etc. So right after this video, if anyone's on, come on. I'll mute it till it's over. Then we could talk about it. Then we're just gonna move on to the next one. The stream will end. Another one will be in its place within a few minutes, and we'll keep going. And I think that's just the best way to handle these short videos and how to discuss them.
Greetings and welcome to the Occult Science series. If you'd like to skip this introduction and go straight to a particular video, the links are provided in the video description below. The point of this series is not to debate the shape of the Earth or its place in the universe, despite the raging battle currently going on YouTube between the ball earthers and the flat earthers. But this is not the place to discuss the logistics of that. So we don't have to worry about calling anybody flat tards or ball tards, or resorting to juvenile name calling. So that aside, what we will be doing is showing religious and spiritual relationships to a heliocentric solar system, a spherical Earth, the theory of gravity, and a Big Bang cosmogony. Now I know those subjects are all part of this debate, but I don't want to offer any conspiratorial conclusions about why those connections are there. This is merely to offer perspective. And to make these connections, I will be using very reasonable sources and mostly scholarly or higher education research. So that's all I'd like to say about that. And moving forward, throughout this presentation, we will maintain respect for others' viewpoints and the authors who are quoted in this series, as many of them will have occult ties to literature and philosophy that is pretty much in line with the concepts of esoteric Freemasonry. So once again, we are not making a judgment on the character of any of these authors or stating that they have some sort of malicious intent for the human race or anything like that. That's up for you to decide. But what I am saying is that there absolutely are religious and spiritual philosophies that are paralleled and connected very fundamentally to mainstream science. So that's all I'm trying to convey here. I'm not trying to convince anybody of either model. Whatever you think about it, for whatever reason you came here, or for whatever you take away from this, if it solidifies your beliefs or it changes them in some way, it doesn't really bother me. Whatever you'd like to believe, that's your thing. I'm not going to give anybody shit for it. Okay, so now that we've got all those disclaimers aside, let's examine the table of contents, so to speak, and the things that we will be covering. So the main theme will be world organizations and their concealed religion, or what is traditionally known as the occult. Now, some people will say that the occult is not a religion, but I would have to disagree with them. And the reasoning for that is simply because when you are speaking about the nature of God and deity in relation to man, the mass of people are going to think that is associated with religion. And I'll give a quick example. Like the athlete who will tell people that, well, I'm not a role model. But when half of the nation's children look up to that person as a role model, it doesn't really matter if they don't think that they're a role model. But since most people view them as one, thus they become a role model. So having set that aside, let's start going through what we will be covering in this series. And first, I will just go over the general research methodology that I am trying to employ, is citing credible, appropriate, and relevant sources, and using logic and reasoning of the literary analysis of what we read to draw practical application to esoteric symbolism and its language, and its relationship to what we've seen in antiquity and history up until the present day. And as far as source citing goes, I am going to use mainstream and scholarly sources that are non-conspiratorial and show the parallels to occult authors who often blur the lines in between these mainstream and scholarly sources, and sometimes are the viewpoints of scholarly sources themselves. And on rare occasions, I may actually cite some quote-unquote conspiracy sources when their viewpoints actually parallel the same views of all of these authors that we read. But the vast majority of everything I'll be quoting will be articles from mainstream, reputable places and people who have been through very prestigious educations. So next we will go over the scientific models that we will be looking at in relationship to esoteric literature. So heliocentrism, a spherical Earth, gravity, the Big Bang Theory, and some things associated with CERN. You know, of course, everything that encompasses all those things like NASA and different universities that produced the scientists who gave us these sorts of ideas. And all of these are directly connected to esoteric Freemasonry, Theosophy, Eastern mysticism, and Gnostic ideologies if you actually go through and understand and read their literature. And then we will also be examining the institutions in relationship to all of these things that we are given in the science world. So first, the United States government and NASA and their Freemasonic ties, the United Nations and Rockefeller Philanthropy having Theosophic ties, and the Vatican astronomy having just basic occult religion ties and associations. And we will show how they all relate to each other and work with each other and have very similar language and ideologies with the esoteric philosophies that are associated with them. We will also examine the founding fathers of all of our modern science. So Copernicus in relation to Pythagorean philosophy, and Pythagoras is very openly considered the first Freemason in relationship to his philosophies and teachings. And then Galileo and his role as an astrologer, Isaac Newton and his very intense interest in alchemy and occult science, Henry Cavendish having Freemasonic ties, and George Lemaitre, a Catholic priest who created or was a foundational father of the Big Bang Theory. We will also be examining some others, but those are the heavy hitters, so to speak. And then in terms of the esoteric literature itself, we will be reading from Albert Pike. His book, Morals and Dogma, is kind of considered to be sort of the Bible of Freemasonry of the Scottish Rite. And then Madame Blavatsky, or Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, HP, and her writings on Theosophy. Manly Palmer Hall, a Freemasonic philosopher who quotes Albert Pike several times in one of his main books, The Secret Teachings of All Ages, and he's very widely renowned. And then Carl Jung, who is a psychologist who you will often find on most lists of influential psychologists throughout history. And then a more modern religious scholar, Elaine Pagels. She's done a lot of writings on Gnosticism. And then Eliphas Levi, or Eliphas Levi, Eliphas Levi, however you'd like to pronounce it. He was a French occultist, and he had Baphomet, however you'd like to pronounce that. And then Aleister Crowley, of course, very strange character, and his writings on magic and esoteric philosophy have very strange parallels to all of the previously mentioned authors. And I'd also like to point out that if you are a fan of certain bands or musicians such as David Bowie and the Beatles and Led Zeppelin, particularly Jimmy Page, he was very influential on them, enough for the Beatles to put him on an album cover and do sort of backwards tracking. And also, Jimmy Page was notoriously obsessed with him and even bought one of his houses for a while, though I don't think he really hung out there too often. He said it had good vibes, though. And David Bowie was heavily enough into Kabbalah and esoteric philosophy to write lyrics about having Aleister Crowley's uniform on and singing about going from Keter to Malkut, which is essentially going from the heavens, the divine, to earth, possibly signifying that he was a divine soul coming to incarnate in a human body, because that's basically the essence of that phrase if you study Kabbalah. Now, some might say that is for his personification of the Ziggy Stardust character, but I don't see why you'd have such deep esoteric lingo embedded into the lyrics if he wasn't very interested in it. So my whole point is that if you like their music, but you think the occult, Kabbalah, any of these things are just utterly stupid, just by their nature of what you think about them, I mean, I think that's kind of an illogical way of approaching it, right? I mean, you have these musical heroes, these brilliant musicians that you look up to and revere, and they're super into it, but you think it's just so dumb, then that doesn't really make sense to me why you would dismiss it. Wouldn't you think that they were dumb? I mean, I'll just reverse it. What if you had a song you really loved, and then you found out it was a Christian rock band, and that whole song was about their relationship with Jesus? And all of a sudden you're like, oh my God, really? Like, oh, I don't like that song now. That's awful. But why wouldn't you apply that same logic to this? If you found out a lot of these things were about Kabbalah and metaphysical religion and uniting with God and all the stuff that goes along with it, but you kind of just, let that slide, whatever, and you still dismiss the other example I gave, I just think you're being a little hypocritical there, don't you think? But the point I'm trying to make is, when there is underlying religion that's hidden from you and you don't know about it, wouldn't that bother you? I mean, especially if you come from a more atheistic worldview and you don't want religion spoon-fed to you with an agenda. I mean, I completely agree with you. I don't want agendas that are attached to religion, given to me without me knowing about it. But then if you find out about the religion and then you actually agree with it, then, I guess that's fine. You've explored it. So that's all I'm suggesting to you. Try to understand some of these things, and I think you'll be very surprised how often it pops up in places you didn't expect it, which segues into the Apollo 11 mission, which we will go over the launch and how it has very strong astrological ties to when they launched it, and this relates to Kabbalah and Freemasonic symbolism and esoteric language such as the eagle has landed. And then lastly, we will also note that there are some very strange and profound connections of John F. Kennedy's astrology chart to the Apollo 11 launch chart, and how we will make these connections. We aren't just going to be quoting astrologers from random websites and stuff. We're actually going to go read Galileo and see what he says about certain astrological placements and what he reveres, and see how that relates to John F. Kennedy and the Apollo 11 launch. And I think you'll be very surprised how accurately these things sync up in relation to what Galileo finds as divine. So we will see you at the next video, where we will be discussing NASA and its relationship to Scottish Rite Freemasonry in relationship to Vatican astronomers. Thank you, and we will see you then.
So that's an interesting introduction. I may not agree with what he calls some of these people, but I guess in that world they may be. don't know what else to say. I could see, I think the legitimacy that I see in what he's saying and what he's presenting is that, hey, you can actually see the sources that he cites directly from the occultists, and just see what they say, see what they provide, rather than what I was doing before, or we just listened to people who researched on occultism and everything that they looked into, and they reported it back to the profound, or the profane, I would say. What's the difference? And taking their word for it. Now, Bill Cooper, when he did that, was 30 years ago. A lot of people now are starting to do it again and continue on in their own research 30 years later, with all that's been happening since then. Has it been 30 years? Can't have been 30 years, has it? 18, almost 30 years. Yeah, almost 30 years. That's crazy. 25 years maybe. All right. So I'm going to guess. I don't have anything much to say about the intro, but I will be interested in seeing what the next episode is going to be. So hold on to your butts. I will be live streaming back in a few minutes with the next part.